Hello, my name is Allie Short, and today we're going to be talking about psychological disorders represented by Chapter 15 of the textbook. So in this chapter, we are going to be talking about what abnormal behavior is. Then we're going to be going into theoretical approaches and how they explore abnormal behavior and psychological disorders. Then we're going to discuss the DSM-V classification system, which has been recently updated, which is why it's so important that you pay attention during this because our textbook is out of date. And anything that you see in red text is something that is either wrong, added, or changed since the publication of our textbook. Disruptive impulse control and conduct disorders I'm going to briefly mention, but we're not going to discuss, and they do not appear in our textbook either. Then we're going to talk about anxiety disorders, mood disorders, and how that is linked to suicide. We're going to talk about dissociative disorders, schizophrenia, personality disorders, and then finally we're going to end the chapter on psychological disorders and health and wellness. And once again, I want you to make sure that you're paying attention really well to anything that is in red font. So abnormal behavior, what is it? Abnormal behavior is behavior that is deviant, maladaptive, or personally distressful over a relatively long period of time. So abnormal behavior essentially has the 3 Ds. It is deviant, dysfunctional, despair. So make those 3 Ds something that you remember: deviant, dysfunctional, and despair. Atypical behavior or deviant behavior, this is something that is not standard. So the example here, washing your hands 4 times an hour, would very much not be normal behavior. You would not expect someone to be doing this. Dysfunctional or maladaptive, the example being believing that you hurt people by breathing and hiding away to avoid being around people because Lord knows your breathing might hurt them. This is dysfunctional, this is maladaptive. You cannot function in the world if you're constantly hiding away because you're afraid that you're going to be hurting people. So that is the dysfunctional part. So deviant means different. Dysfunctional means that it's not working in your everyday life. That third D, despair, or personally distressing. This is you're feeling extreme guilt or shame. You feel bad about it. It is upsetting to you. And this is over a relatively long time period as well. It is important to know that context matters. For example, that washing your hands 4 times an hour, if you are working in a lab with tissues and human body and something that could be contaminated, washing your hands 4 times an hour might be completely normal. So context always matters. So when it comes to psychological disorders, we're really going to be spending our time focusing on 3 individual approaches and then one that combines those 3. So the biological approach is also known as the medical model, and this is saying that disorders have a biological origin, which makes sense with everything that we've learned about thus far in regards to the biological approach. The psychological approach is saying this has to do with your experiences, your thoughts, your emotions, your personality, all those things that are sort of going on in your mind and your memories and your thoughts. The sociocultural approach is one that is looking at society and culture and all of those things that happen to influence you within a culture. And then finally, we have the biopsychosocial model that combines all of these factors. The biological approach, also known as the medical model, is the view that the psychological disorders are medical diseases with a biological origin, which means that these disorders should not be blamed on the individual because it's like a disease. It is something that needs to be cured. That is the negative, though. A criticism of the biological approach and the medical model is that it implies that there's something wrong with these people and that these people need to be fixed. So it is looking at as all these abnormalities are mental illnesses, and so it's saying that we need to cure because that's what you want to do with an illness, and that the afflicted individuals are just patients, and the people who are treating these patients are doctors, and once again, we're looking at that they need to be fixed in some sort of way. And so it's saying we're going to focus on the brain, genetic factors, neurotransmitters. A lot of the medications that treat psychological disorders are, in fact, impacting these neurotransmitters. So the psychological approach is going to focus on the experiences, thoughts, emotions, and personality of the person with the abnormal behavior. So in the development and the course of psychological disorders, we're looking at what you are thinking about, your rumination and co-ruminating with others, and that sort of thought process that creates you. It also is going to be looking at your childhood experiences in kind of that Freudian way. We're going to be looking at personality trait development. These are the things that we're going to be looking at in the psychological approach. So the sociocultural approach is going to be looking at things like gender, ethnicity, your socioeconomic status, family relationships and dynamics between people, the culture in which you live, the technological aspects of culture, religious aspects of culture. All of these things absolutely play a role in individuals. There's lots of research to support this. So if you're looking for words that you might want to associate it with this, it's going to say they're female, that they're male in reference to their gender. It may reference the specific culture in which they live. They may reference individualist cultures or Western cultures, or it may say something about Asian cultures. So you may want looking for different words to associate with those characteristics in those multiple choice questions. And if they're asking about because of their gender, things like that, you may be looking for that sociocultural approach. Socioeconomic status is very important within this category, and it has been shown to have much greater impact than ethnicity on how you develop psychologically. And this should make sense because if you think about the impact of poverty, if you are worried about and constantly stressing about, can I pay my bills, can I support my family, the expectations that you might have as a parent that you cannot fulfill because of living in poverty and not having what you need, leading to learned helplessness and all sorts of other things, this can obviously have a negative psychological impact. So the biopsychosocial model is one of the ones that combines all of these, the biological factors, the psychological factors, and those sociocultural factors in determining what causes this abnormal behavior and these sort of psychological disorders. And most people actually embrace this, the biopsychosocial model, because usually it is not just one thing causing that. So the biological factors are your genes, your psychological factors as your childhood experiences and your thoughts, and then your sociocultural factors all combined. So if you're looking for a question, you're going to be looking for it to be referencing more than just one of those things. If it's talking about just your genetics or your neurotransmitters, you're looking at that biological approach. If you're looking at your childhood experiences and your thoughts and how you're always following a really negative thought pattern, that's your psychological factors. But your sociocultural factors included with those things, talking about your gender, on top of that, that is what makes it the biopsychosocial model. So the DSM-V classification system, the DSM meaning the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, that is the major classification of psychological disorders in the United States. That is what we use. And there are a lot of advantages to using a classification system. So an advantage would be it provides a common basis for communication between doctors. So this is something that if you are getting treatment in Chicago and then you move to someplace in California, you want your medical professional to be able to look at your notes and say, oh, this is what you're experiencing, and make your treatment consistent between locations. It helps clinicians make predictions. So if we have a diagnostic manual that says, if you're experiencing these symptoms, these treatments, this disorder, that we know what type of medication, what type of symptoms we can expect to appear in the future, if we expect any changes, if the pattern of behavior that we're seeing is consistent with other people, this can be very useful. Naming a disorder can provide comfort to some people. So they want to know, why am I like this? Why am I behaving this way? Why am I so different? By naming the disorder, they say, oh, I have this, and this explains the behavior. It maybe makes them feel connected because there's other people who are having the same difficulties or same conditions or feelings or emotions or whatever it may be. So that can be advantageous as well. However, there are also disadvantages of using the DSM and having this classification system. One is that there's a stigma associated with this. When you are giving someone a disorder and you're saying, hey, this is the name, you have this, there can be some shame or negative reputations with the disease. Some people might not want to date someone who suffers from bipolar disorder or PTSD or whatever the case may be. Medical terminology tends to imply that there's some sort of internal cause, and people may not like that. It tends to focus on the weaknesses of people, and it ignores strengths. You notice that when we're talking this chapter, we are typically not looking at the humanistic perspective right now. And so there is a reason for that. So the DSM-V came out in 2013. Before that, we had the DSM-IV. And the new version, the DSM-V, which is what we will be using and what the AP exam is going to be looking at the moment, is divided currently into 3 sections. So section 1 explains the changes of the DSM. So we were at the DSM-IV. Hey, what are the changes now to get us to this version that we have? Section 2 is all the diagnostic criteria and codes, and that's where all your psychological disorders and descriptions are. Section 3, that is emerging measures and models, and basically this section is there to stimulate further research about things that we don't have enough information on at the moment to maybe categorize them in Section 2. This is really all that we're going to learn about Section 3. So the DSM-V Section 1 explains the changes from the DSM-IV. And the DSM-IV had this multi-axial system with axes 1 through 5, and this is where all the information in the manual was contained and organized. Axes 1 through 3 are now all in Section 2. Section 1, once again, is just explaining what is going on in the DSM-V and why they're making these changes. Axis 5 doesn't even exist. The Global Assessment of Functioning has been dropped, which will make sense in a minute. Once again, all the psychological disorders are listed in Section 2 of the DSM-V. Disorders usually first diagnosed in infancy, childhood, or adolescence are now listed throughout all those other chapters in Section 2, so that section has been removed. Sequential order in the DSM-V actually matters, and the order now relates to the significance and relationship between those diagnoses, so they're sort of clumped together in things that are similar or maybe overlapping where people have multiple disorders at the same time. Section 1 also explains why are we making these changes? What's the justification for this? And so it's referencing field trials, public and professional review, expert review, and the idea is they want to harmonize and get in line with the ICD-10 or the 10th revision of the International Statistical Classification of Diseases and Related Health Problems. So that is a medical classification listed by the World Health Organization, and if you think about the world being more global today, it makes sense that we may want to look more closely at what other countries are doing around the world so that we are aligned. This is going to be also replacing not otherwise specified, and so not otherwise specified was a category that includes psychotic symptomatology, which is like delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, grossly disorganized or catatonic behavior, about which there wasn't adequate information to make a specific diagnosis, or about which there is contradictory information, or disorders with psychotic systems that do not meet the criteria for any specific psychotic disorder. So that has been replaced with other specified disorder, which means that there's a way for them to specify the reason that the criteria for specific disorders are not being met, or unspecified disorder that basically says the clinician has they've foregone the opportunity to give it a specification. They're just saying, hey, this is a disorder. So on this slide, what you are seeing are psychological disorders that are currently in Section 2 of the DSM-V that were formerly a part of Axis 1. So this is not a comprehensive list of Section 2, but this is Section 2 as would have been in Axis 1. So you'll notice the changes in red. So disorders usually first diagnosed in infancy, childhood, or adolescence, and communication disorders, which we already mentioned, those are no longer listed as its own separate category. Anxiety disorders still have their own separate category, but there have been some changes there as well. Somatic symptom and related disorders has related somatoform disorders. Factitious disorders, dissociative disorders, delirium, dementia, amnesia, and other cognitive disorders, mood disorders, which we'll be talking about here a little bit more, schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders, substance-related disorders, sexual and gender identity disorders, which we talked about earlier in the year, eating disorders, which we also talked about earlier this year, and sleep disorders, which we also talked about earlier this year. Impulse control disorders, elsewhere not classified, and adjustment disorders. Some other major categories in Section 2 of the DSM-V, which were formerly a part of Axis 2 disorders, include intellectual disabilities, personality disorders, and other conditions that may be a focus of clinical attention. So in the textbook, there is a critical controversy box text on psychological disorders, real or myth, talking particularly about ADHD. Please make sure that you've read this and can discuss it in class. Some questions that I want you to be able to answer when we discuss the critical controversy are: when do you think it is appropriate to label someone as having a psychological disorder? When do you think medical treatments for psychological disorders are appropriate? And if a teacher suggested that your child be tested for ADHD, what do you think you would do and why? So I stated before that I was going to mention disruptive, impulse control, and conduct disorders, but we're not really going to talk about them in length. And the reason for this is they're not in the textbook, which means we're not going to be testing on it. However, I think some of these are really interesting. Oppositional defiant disorder has 3 types of symptoms: angry, irritable mood, argumentative, defiant behavior, and vindictiveness. Very interesting disorder. We have conduct disorder, other specified and unspecified disruptive disorder, impulse control disorder, intermittent explosive disorder, pyromania, kleptomania, and antisocial personality disorder. I can sort of see why people might be really interested in these, and feel free to research them further. If you want to talk about one of them in class in particular, please just let me know, and I will try to find time for it. So anxiety disorders are uncontrollable fears that are disproportionate to the actual danger and disruptive to ordinary life. So one thing that I will definitely want you to be aware of when it comes to anxiety disorders: if there's a reason to be fearful, you don't have an anxiety disorder, you have anxiety. For example, if you're in Auschwitz as a Jew during World War II, your being anxious is totally reasonable. Anxiety disorders that we are going to talk about a little bit more include generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, agoraphobia, which is now separate from panic disorder, which in the DSM-IV they were combined, phobic disorder, separation anxiety disorder, selective mutism. Something that I want you to be aware of is that obsessive-compulsive disorders and PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, now have their own categories: obsessive-compulsive and related disorders, and trauma and stressor-related disorders, respectively. And once again, I want to make sure that you're understanding anxiety disorders in particular. The sequential order of the chapter reflects the close relationship of them within the DSM-V. So generalized anxiety disorder, which is obviously within that category of anxiety disorders, is persistent anxiety for at least 6 months where you don't actually have a reason for that anxiety. For example, if it's the month approaching May and you're taking 5 AP courses, it may be totally normal for you to have a little bit of anxiety. This is saying you don't know what that is. Etiology is a word that you need to know, especially for AP Psych, but just in general, it's a good word to know. And that's the causes or significant preceding conditions. And basically, it's saying what is causing this disease, this illness, or in our case, psychological disorders. So biological factors would be a genetic predisposition. And in this case, there are biological factors for generalized anxiety disorder. Some of them having to do with the GABA deficiency, which is a neurotransmitter that we learned about earlier in Chapter 3. It can have sympathetic nervous system activity, respiration, your respiratory system. All these things will be biological factors contributing to generalized anxiety disorder. Psychological and sociocultural factors obviously can also be a part of that etiology. So harsh self-standards, so that's you imposing self-standards on yourself, critical parents, or other critical adults in your life. It doesn't necessarily have to be parents. It could be coaches. It could be your boss, whomever. Automatic negative thoughts. That's your rumination going down that negative Nancy path. History of uncontrollable trauma, like an abusive parent, not necessarily sexually, but it could be physical. It could be verbally. All these things. Anything uncontrollable always increases anxiety. Another psychological disorder that falls under the umbrella of anxiety disorder is a panic disorder. And so this is recurrent sudden onsets of intense terror that often occur without warning. And basically this is your occurrence of panic attacks. And a panic attack is something that makes you feel really awful. A lot of people who experience them kind of think that they're having a heart attack. Some of the characteristics of a panic attack are severe heart palpitations, so your heart is racing, extreme shortness of breath, you have that chest pain, you may be trembling, you may be sweating, you could be dizzy, you have this feeling of helpless, it's overwhelming and sort of crushing you. And they've added categories for panic attacks of unexpected panic attacks and expected panic attacks for the DSM-V, which once again, that is why that is in that red font. Panic disorder and agoraphobia are now unlinked. So before you would see agoraphobia here as sort of a characteristic within this panic attack world, but it is no longer there. Etiology, so that once again we are looking at what are the causes. There are biological factors, a genetic predisposition to suffer from a panic attack and have panic disorder. And there are psychological factors, so if you misinterpret arousal, that is something that absolutely can affect you. So we talked about this before in class, where you may have the exact physiological response, but one person's going to identify as, I'm excited to give this presentation in class, I'm going to show my knowledge, isn't that amazing? And someone else may feel, I'm terrified, I have absolutely no desire, despite the fact that physiologically they're having that exact same response. And then you also have those cultural factors influencing it. So females, for example, are 2 times as likely to suffer from a panic disorder and experience panic attacks. And just a fun fact, Charles Darwin suffered from this. So another anxiety disorder in the DSM-V is agoraphobia. And agoraphobia is one of those phobias that always seems to get tested. It's a really common one to occur on the AP Psych exam, so please learn. And so this is your extreme or irrational fear of crowded spaces or enclosed public places. Previously on the DSM-IV, this was a subset of panic disorder, and now it is separate. I know it's a little redundant from the previous slide, but I want to make sure that you have all the information in every location. So this anxiety disorder is characterized by fear of wide open places, uncontrollable social situations, unfamiliar places, shopping malls, parks, etc. This is just a really common one, so I want to stress it again. Agoraphobia, irrational fear of crowded places, crowds, etc. So also within the anxiety disorder umbrella are those phobic disorders, which everyone really seems to enjoy discussing and learning about. So what this is an irrational, overwhelming, persistent fear of a particular object or situation, which once again, context matters because it's an irrational fear. So here we also have social anxiety disorder, which has replaced the term social phobia in the DSM-V. And this is an intense fear of being humiliated or embarrassed in social situations. So please make sure that you're keeping social anxiety disorder and agoraphobia as different. This is that you are going to be humiliated as opposed to just being afraid of that situation. So please make sure that you're paying attention to that distinction. I think that will be a highly missed question. There was a deletion of the requirement that individuals over the 18 years of age recognize that their anxiety is excessive or unreasonable. The 6-month duration was expanded to include all ages, so this is something that has to go on for 6 months, not like something like, oh, I saw a snake or got bitten by a snake last week, so you're a little hesitant for a few weeks to be around snakes. This is a long-term thing. Panic disorder and agoraphobia are unlinked, which once again, that is a phobia, which is why we're showing that it's unlinked. Generalized specifier has been deleted and replaced with a performance-only specifier. And so when we're looking at that etiology, once again, that cause, we're looking at biological factors, so there is a biological factor. And so there is a neural circuit issue with the thalamus, amygdala, and cerebral cortex. And if you think about the thalamus, that's that relay center of the brain. The amygdala, which is your fear center of the brain. And then your cerebral cortex, which has a lot of your higher functioning. And it makes sense that your fears would sort of be based on your stimulus of information with the thalamus. The amygdala, which is your fear center, that makes sense that your fears would be linked to the fear center of your brain. And cerebral cortex, how you process it, what you think about things. All of these majorly impacting phobic disorders. And then psychological factors, I mean, it can be learned. Classical conditioning, if you remember little Albert, we trained him to be afraid of the little white rat, and he generalized that to be afraid of all little white fuzzy creatures because, oh my goodness, white bunnies, very scary. It is Easter time. So phobic disorders, it is no longer a requirement that individuals over the age of 18 recognize that it is excessive or unreasonable. Something that may be a good idea for you to do is to look at figure 15.3 on page 495 of your textbook. It's a little hard to read on here, but it goes over a lot of the different types of phobias, but there's way more than this. This is just a limited list. Xenophobia, a fear of strangers, I feel like is one I need to highlight as a social studies teacher, but certainly may be a good idea to know quite a number of these. I would also really like it if you learned agoraphobia, because once again, highly tested. So, social anxiety disorder, which used to be called social phobias, are quite common in the United States. So there's lots of different social phobias. So fear of public speaking, 30.2% of the American people are going to experience this phobia at some point in time in their life. Talking in front of a small group is 15.2%. talking with others, 13.7%, using a toilet away from home, which I feel will be very inconvenient on vacation, 6.6%, writing while someone watches, which I think is kind of creepy anyway, 6.4%, and eating or drinking in public is 2.7%. If you have me in class, you know that I eat and drink in front of you every single day. It's first period, coffee is important. So obsessive-compulsive and related disorders is a new category within the DSM-V, but OCD has always been there. And so the diagnosis and symptoms for OCD include persistent anxiety-provoking thoughts and or urges to perform repetitive, ritualistic behaviors to prevent or produce a situation. So the cognitive perspective on this is saying that you have the inability to turn off negative, intrusive thoughts by ignoring or effectively dismissing them, which psychologically healthy or traditional normal people, psychologically typical people, as sometimes they're called, can do this. So this is saying you have this obsession, which is your recurrent thoughts or compulsions, recurrent behaviors. Some common ones: excessive checking, cleansing, counting. So this would be you have to check the door to make sure that it's locked 15 times before you leave the home, which would be very inconvenient and time-consuming in the morning. This is cleansing, or maybe you have to get out a new bar of soap every single time that you wash your hands. Or counting. Every time you come to class, you have to count every single ceiling tile, which would probably make it a little difficult to get the learning on since there's a lot of ceiling tiles in Davidson. So what might be causing this? So biological factors play a role. So there's a genetic predisposition for OCD. Some families have quite a bit of OCD occurring in them. Something that is consistent is more activity in the frontal cortex, basal ganglia, and thalamus. Smaller amygdala, which may be counterintuitive, so make sure you pay attention to that. So a smaller amygdala may be linked to OCD, and lower levels of serotonin and dopamine. And stress can certainly trigger this or bring this out more people. This always makes me think of Sheldon Cooper going penny, penny, penny. So OCD, that's what you can think of if you are a fan of the Big Bang Theory. So obsessive-compulsive and related disorders has some new disorders within this category, which is a new category. So we have hoarding disorder. And if you've ever seen Hoarders, it's a great TV show about people who have saved all sorts of things. And these are things that have value. This is, I've saved all my Wendy's wrappers because Wendy's wrappers are just oh so useful, and I might need all 3,000 of these Wendy's wrappers. And creating little pathways through your home, and the piles of stuff collapse on you, and it takes you 2 days to be found by a loved one. That is hoarding disorder. Excoriation or skin picking disorder. This is where you pick at your skin. It causes you to bleed. It is not very pleasant. We have substance and medication-induced obsessive-compulsive and related disorder. Obsessive-compulsive related disorder due to another medical condition. We have trichotillomania, which is hair-pulling disorder. And then we also have new specifiers with poor insight, with fair insight, with good insight, with absent insight, or delusional. Once again, these are new, which is why they are in red font in the DSM-V. So the new category of trauma and stress-related disorders includes PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. And some of the symptoms that develop as a result of exposure to traumatic event, oppressive situation, natural and unnatural disasters that have overwhelmed a person's abilities to cope. So this is something, you are in a war zone, that you experience a hurricane or a tsunami or an earthquake, landslide. It could be an assault. All these different things can create sort of a traumatic situation that causes you to have some of the following symptoms. So you have flashbacks, which is reliving that terrible moment. We have avoidance of emotional experience and talking with others, so you don't want to talk about it. You're not interested in talking about it. You want to not really cope with it, essentially. We have the constricted ability to feel emotions. So this means that you are experiencing fewer emotions or less emotions, or you're lacking those emotions that you felt before. We have excessive arousal, meaning that you have that inability to sleep or an exaggerated startle response, so that you are struggling, you're trying to sleep, but you're not getting enough sleep. And certainly something you should realize is that a lot of psychological disorders have a sleep component to it, and a lack of sleep can contribute to psychological disorders, and that a lot of psychological disorders disrupt sleep, which then creates this cyclical problem. difficulties with memory and concentration. Obviously, this is going to be a problem in a person's life. We have feelings of apprehension, and then once again, this impulsive outbursts. But if you think about when you're extremely tired, you may be more inclined to have impulsive outbursts as well. There are 4 major symptom clusters in this new DSM-V. We have re-experiencing, avoidance, persistent negative alteration in cognitions and mood, and then that arousal. So when looking at the etiology of PTSD, we're looking for that stressor criterion, which is for the DSM-V, requires being explicit to whether qualifying traumatic events were experienced directly, witnessed, or experienced indirectly. So you can witness a war and maybe weren't a soldier in it and weren't assaulted personally, but you are seeing that struggle. That can affect you. So it doesn't necessarily have to be something that you experience directly. You can experience it indirectly. You can witness it, etc. And so the subjective reaction has been moved as well from the DSM-V. So trauma, we got that combat and war related. We have sexual abuse and assault. We have natural and unnatural disasters, plane crashes, terrorist attacks, etc. that we already discussed. Vulnerability. When we talk about resilience in numerous previous chapters, we talked about that ability to handle things and to not suffer the consequences when bad things happen. And so a lack of resilience and having vulnerability, perhaps a previous history of trauma, previous history of abuse, maybe you have a psychological disorder, you may have a genetic predisposition for this, but you may have a just natural tendency to be more vulnerable to PTSD. So some people can go through that same experience and not experience PTSD, and other people can experience PTSD in far less traumatic experiences. So a mood disorder is a disturbance of mood that affects the entire emotional state. And you think that a mood is a prolonged emotion that colors the individual's entire emotional state. So this is saying it is very much affected who you are, how you're feeling. So depressive disorders are in this umbrella of mood disorders. And so we have major depressive disorder and dysthymic disorder are in that category of depressive disorders. And then we also have bipolar disorder. And you should know that mood disorders in general are correlated with slightly higher rates of suicide. And so after we talk about mood disorders, we're going to be talking about suicide rates, and how that affects people with psychological disorders, but also just people in general. So symptoms may include cognitive behavior and physical symptoms, and interpersonal difficulties are things that you should be looking at concerning mood disorder. So let's take a look at the mood disorder, major depressive disorder, or MDD. So significant depressive episode that lasts for at least 2 weeks. So if you're sad for a day or two, they are not going to label you as having major depressive disorder. This is going to be significant depression that lasts for at least 2 weeks, and you need to have at least 5 of the following 9 symptoms. So you have depressed mood most of the day, you have reduced interest or pleasure in all or most activities, significant weight gain or significant weight loss, or significant decrease in appetite or significant decrease in appetite. All of these things, anytime you see changes in your appetite, changes in weight in either direction, that is typically not a good sign for your psychological health at the moment. Trouble sleeping or sleeping too much is another characteristic of major depressive disorder, and I know that I've mentioned this before, but sleep is often linked to psychological problems, whether it is causing it or a cause of, and then once again entering that cycle of I'm not getting enough sleep, it contributes to my psychological problems make it harder for me to sleep, I'm more exhausted, and so on. Fatigue and loss of energy, which makes sense that if you're having trouble with sleeping in any way, shape, or form. You got psychological and physical agitation. You may have lethargy, so you could be agitated and sort of very hyper-aware looking around, or you may be just very lethargic and slow moving. This can lead to more accidents, both walking and driving. You have feeling worthless or guilty, and this is in an excessive or inappropriate way. So if you feel guilty because you did something crappy, that's just called guilt. That's normal. But you're feeling extra guilty or extra worthless, and it's probably not warranted. You can have problems thinking, concentrating, or making decisions, which obviously can affect your school performance, your work performance, your performance in extracurricular activities, which may then, after you are struggling in those areas, they may contribute to feeling worthless or guilty in an excessive and inappropriate manner. So sometimes these things are interrelated. Recurrent thoughts of death and suicide, and no history of manic episodes. Those periods of euphoric moods may be more associated with bipolar disorder. With major depressive disorder or MDD, daily functioning will be impaired. Looking at the DSM-V, in particular, the coexistence within a major depressive disorder of at least 3 manic symptoms is insufficient to satisfy the criteria for a manic episode, is now acknowledged with the specifier of with mixed feature, and so this increases the likelihood that the illness exists in a bipolar spectrum. Something that I don't agree with that is new for the DSM-V is that the bereavement exclusion was removed. So this was an exclusion applied to depression symptoms lasting less than 2 months following the death of a loved one. So if you were married to someone for 53 years and you are now sad for 1 month, congratulations, you have major depressive disorder. And so as long as I have an M.Ed. after my name and not an M.D. or Ph.D., I have no say in it, but the bereavement exclusion has been removed. So when we're looking at the etiology or the cause of MDD or major depressive disorder, we may be looking at biological factors, psychological factors, or sociocultural factors. So that's that biopsychosocial model. So if we're looking at just the biological factors, once again, this is your genetic predisposition. So you can have an underactive prefrontal cortex, you can have issues with your neurotransmitters. A lot of the medications that are used today affect those neurotransmitters. So this can be regulation of serotonin or norepinephrine, and those would all be within that biological perspective, biological umbrella when examining major depressive disorder. Psychological factors may be learned helplessness, which we've talked about ad nauseum this year, which is that idea that you learn that you do not have control over a situation and then you stop trying, and it's very difficult to get out of learned helplessness. Ruminating on negative self-defeating thoughts. We talked about co-ruminating earlier this year as well, sort of going down that rabbit hole of bad thoughts and half glass empty, not half full type of ideas. Pessimistic attribution, which is the antithesis of being an optimist, meaning the opposite of being an optimist. These people, when you hear someone saying, I'm a pessimist, they often say, well, I'm just being a realist, but really looking at that half glass empty type of viewpoint. Sociocultural factors in regards to major depressive disorder, we're looking at poverty. Women head of households in particular and minorities. Women in general are 2 times as likely. But when looking at that poverty, if you think about what's going to cause you to be upset and sad and depressed and have that learned helplessness, if you're constantly learning that you do not have enough money and that your job is not covering your bills and that you can't pay the rent or can't provide for your child, all of these things absolutely can have an impact on how you are viewing things and how happy that you are. So continuing with mood disorders, we have persistent depressive disorder and the category of a dysthymic disorder. And so things that we're looking for is chronic depression here. So this is unbroken depressed mood lasting at least 2 years in adults or 1 year within a child. And in an adult, less than 2 months, regular mood still can equate to a diagnosis. This has fewer symptoms than your MDD, your major depressive disorder. But you can have 2 of the 6 symptoms here, which is poor appetite or overeating. You have sleep problems. You have low energy or fatigue. You have low self-esteem, poor concentration or difficulty making decisions, and feeling of hopelessness. Dysthymic disorder falls in the category of persistent depressive disorder, and this is a change for the DSM-V, and this goes along with a chronic major depressive disorder as well. So something that is really sad that we're going to talk about in AP psychology is childhood depression, which goes in that mood disorder category. And so what leads to this psychopathology? And so there are some risk factors for depression in children. So parental psychopathology and genetics. So if you come from a family that has lots of depression in it, your likelihood of suffering from childhood depression is in fact much higher. And there's some things that help you avoid it, which I guess is the positive side. If you have a supportive adult role model or a strong extended family, these are things that have you connections to people, having friends, having community, being on a sports team and being active within it and feeling like you belong. All of these things help avoid and build resistance to childhood depression. And once again, genetics can also play a positive role. We tend to focus a lot of times on a genetic predisposition for some sort of problem and leading to some sort of psychological disorder or some sort of problem. However, genetics also can have very positive influences and make you naturally resilient to things. So another mood disorder that you need to know about for the AP psychology exam is bipolar disorder. And so there's bipolar 1, which is more severe, and bipolar 2, which is less severe. And so when we're looking at bipolar 1, we're looking at hallucinations. So this is where you're seeing and hearing things that are in fact not there. We have mania, which is that overexcited, unrealistically optimistic state. We have that, and we have a new specifier with mixed features in there as well. And so once again, you have the same characteristics in bipolar 2, just less extreme. So manic and hypomanic episodes now include an emphasis on changes in activity and energy, as well as in mood. The frequency and separation of these episodes is often quite long, so it can be separated by 6 months to a year, which can be problematic because some people may think, well, I'm cured, I don't need to take my medication anymore, and then that's when symptoms can recur. The etiology or cause of bipolar disorder has a very strong genetic component. So if you're looking at a question saying, which of these is most significantly influenced by biological factors, you may be wanting to think bipolar disorder as an answer. There's swings in metabolic activity in the cerebral cortex, which are contribute to bipolar disorder, and swings in levels of neurotransmitters. So we have really high levels of norepinephrine and glutamate, and we have low levels of serotonin. And so once again, neurotransmitters play a major role in a lot of these psychological disorders that we are discussing in this chapter. So one of the saddest things that we're going to talk about in AP Psychology is also suicide. And so what our textbook says about suicide is that life with a psychological disorder can be so difficult that some individuals choose to end it. Suicide is not a diagnosable disorder, but is rather a tragic consequence of psychological disorders, most commonly depression and anxiety. Individuals suffering from depression are also likely to attempt suicide more than once, which is not uncommon for individuals to contemplate suicide at some point in your life. So you may think about suicide at some point in time, and it may not be considered abnormal. However, attempting or completing the act of suicide is absolutely abnormal. And so according to the National Institute of Mental Health, people in the United States committed suicide quite a bit, which is very sad. And suicide was the 11th highest cause of death in general. However, research indicates that for every completed suicide, there's 8 to 25 attempted suicides, which is quite tragic. And it is the third leading cause of death after automobile accidents and homicides for adolescents 13 to 19 years of age and adolescents 10 to 14 years of age. And so it's very tragic. So once again, we're going to be looking at the etiology component. And so what factors are contributing, those biological factors, psychological factors, and sociocultural factors contribute to people committing suicide. So low levels of serotonin, the neurotransmitter, absolutely contribute. People are 10 times more likely to try again. People with poor health, these are biological factors contributing to suicide rates. Psychological factors include mental disorders. In fact, 90% of people who successfully commit suicide suffer from some sort of psychological disorder. Trauma, especially a recent, immediate, and highly stressful trauma, something like sexual abuse, loss of a job, flunking out of school, an unwanted pregnancy, all these type of traumas contribute to suicide rates as well. Substance abuse, and if you think about the use of drugs and what it does to your mental state and your inhibitions and all these different things, it shouldn't be shocking that substance abuse absolutely can contribute to suicide rates. Sociocultural factors, so we have your chronic economic hardship. So if you're living in poverty, if you do not have what you need, suicide absolutely might be a more appealing option. Then it also creates stress, which can create all sorts of different problems. Cultural and religious norms are also contributing factors. For example, in the United States, we have a Judeo-Christian background. In particular, Catholicism has a very negative view on suicide and is not supported within the community, whereas in some places it's considered honorable. In ancient Rome, sometimes your family was spared if you committed suicide, but if you didn't commit suicide, your whole family would be killed or sold into slavery. So certainly, depending on your cultural views regarding suicide, it's going to affect it. And the more supportive you are of suicide, the more suicides that you will have. Gender differences as well, which we will talk about on the next slide. So women are 3 times more likely to attempt suicide. However, men are way more likely to actually commit suicide. So once again, women are 3 times more likely to attempt it, but men are 4 times more likely to complete suicide, and they are more likely to use a firearm, which makes sense. If you are using a slow, painless, painkiller type of way of suicide, someone may find your body and before you're actually a body, and they can revive you, send you to the hospital, these type of things. Whereas if you shoot yourself in the head, unless your name's Robespierre, most likely you are going to be dead. The highest suicide rate is among non-Latino men aged 85 and older. And we talked about this in class saying, well, why is it non-Latino men aged 85 and older? Latino men are typically going to be coming from a Catholic background, which we already said was not supportive of suicide in general. But in addition to that, the Latino community is notorious for having really strong community and family connections, which lower suicide rates across the board. Once again, if you know somebody who is threatening suicide, please, please, please look at these what to do and not to do. But you want to make sure that you are being a good listener and that you are supporting them and that you are please reporting it to an adult, report it to a teacher, report it to an administrator, report it to a counselor, somebody so that we can find that person help. You also want to make sure that you are not ignoring them, you're not giving them disapproval, you're not giving them those false assurances of everything's going to be okay, everything's going to be all right. If somebody is threatening suicide, you've probably been told one of these things and been annoyed before. You certainly do not want to give them these false promises if someone is truly suicidal. So please make sure that you are being supportive. So another category that we're going to be talking about in the DSM-V is dissociative disorder. And this is a sudden loss of memory or change in identity due to the dissociation or separation of the individual's conscious awareness from previous memories and thoughts. And the idea is that this dissociation, this change of personality, is usually in protection. So your body is protecting itself, your mind is protecting itself from some sort of extreme shock or stress that maybe your initial personality couldn't cope with. Problems integrating emotional memories, these are things. So we have dissociative amnesia and dissociative identity disorder. So there could be two very different things. And we have dissociative fugue state is now a specifier for dissociative amnesia rather than being its own separate diagnosis. If you watch Breaking Bad, the main character fakes one of these fugue states. So the first of the dissociative disorders that we're going to look at is dissociative amnesia. And so this is individuals experience extreme memory loss caused by extensive psychological stress. So the only aspects of their own identity and autobiographical experiences are forgotten. So basically you have stress and you lose lots and lots of information about who you are. So only aspects of their own identity and autobiographical experience are forgotten, meaning that you know how to write, you know how to talk, you know how to count and do math and maybe your job, but who you are, all your personal experiences are gone. The dissociative fugue state is basically you're experiencing that, but you wander off and you go someplace new and you assume a new identity. So this would be like you walking out of AP Psych class today, and instead of going to your next class, you're going to get in your car, you're going to drive to Pennsylvania, you're going to get a new identity, you're going to work at a diner for a while, and you're not really you anymore for an extended period of time. So the second dissociative disorder that we're going to talk about is dissociative identity disorder. And this was formerly known as multiple personality disorder. So if you hear someone talking about multiple personality disorder, what they're talking about in today's terminology and lingo is dissociative identity disorder, or DID. So this is the most dramatic and least common and the most controversial of the dissociative disorders. So this is something that is really not common. I would not buy it if I was on a jury. Diagnoses and symptoms include the same individual possesses two or more distinct personalities. Symptoms of disruption may be reported as well as observed, so someone may see you switch between these personalities. Each personality has unique memories, behaviors, and relationships, and that only one of these personalities is dominant at a time. So you may have Fred and George in the same person, and when Fred is there, Fred is dominant. When George is dominant, George is dominant, and that is very important. So personality shifts lead to gaps in recall. Sometimes it occurs under distress and every day, not just during traumatic events. Something else, experiences of pathological possession in some cultures are included in the description of identity disruption. So what are we looking at when here in terms of etiology? What is causing this dissociative identity disorder? So extraordinarily severe abuse in early childhood is present in 70% of these diagnoses. There is a social contagion component to that, and that's mostly women, and it can run in families. And basically the idea is the individual compartmentalizes different aspects of the self into different identities to cope with different situations. So schizophrenia is a disorder that is talked about quite a bit in our textbook, and it is characterized by highly disordered thought. So it's a thought disorder which refers to the unusual, sometimes bizarre thought processes that are part of schizophrenia. And so there is a psychotic break here. This is a split from reality. This is typically diagnosed in early adulthood, so that's something fun to think about, is that if you are schizophrenic, you probably do not know this yet. It has a very high suicide rate, 8 times higher than the general population in terms of suicide among people with schizophrenia. And that's in the United States specifically. And so there are positive symptoms and negative symptoms and cognitive symptoms. So there's 3 types of symptoms here. And positive symptoms are things that are additions. So this is like an addition sign. So positive means the addition. So we have hallucinations, which is something you have. Like hallucination is something you have in addition to being a normal functioning person. You have delusions. You have thought disorders, meaning the orders of your thoughts are somewhat confusing. And you have disorders of movement. And negative symptoms, that is something being taken away. So let's talk about that a little bit more. So we have hallucinations. And so that is the idea that you have sensory experiences in the absence of real stimuli. So there isn't something there, but you have auditory and visual sensations. Less common, though possible. You can have smells or taste. You could literally smell something that isn't there or taste something that isn't there. Delusions are those false, unusual, and sometimes magical beliefs that are not a part of your culture. So if there's a magical belief that is a part of your culture, that is not considered a delusion. So if it is a part of your religion and that is a religious norm, that is not. However, if you believe that you are Jesus Christ or Muhammad, that would be a delusion. The idea that your thoughts are being broadcast over the radio, that would be a delusion. Disorganized speech, that is something that in the DSM-V must have one of these core positive symptoms. This thought disorder is word salad. So this is making up new words. It's referential thinking. So that referential thinking is when you are ascribing personal meaning to completely random events, like traffic light turns red because you're in a hurry, which some of you may have thought before, perhaps this morning. Disorders of movement, so this could be unusual mannerisms. You have your body movements, you have facial expressions that may repeat over and over and over again. Or you could have catatonia, which is, this is a state of immobility. Like you are not moving. This says, Simon says, stand still, and you are going to stand still, and you're going to stand still for a really long period of time. Like we have with other psychological disorders, we're going to be talking about the etiology, this time of schizophrenia. And once again, when we're looking at the etiology, we're going to be looking at those biological factors, the psychological factors, and those sociocultural factors. And so with schizophrenia, there is also a genetic predisposition, as we've mentioned with many of the other psychological disorders, which means that schizophrenia can run in families. Structural brain abnormalities, this is something that can occur in the prenatal period of gestation. Enlarged ventricles and fluid-filled sacs in the brain that can indicate deterioration of brain tissue is something that can be a contributing factor. Smaller and less active prefrontal cortex. Also, once again, those neurotransmitters are very important to a lot of psychological disorders, but this is moving sort of the opposite direction. And this is saying that there's an excessive amount of dopamine production, kind of the opposite of what we've been seeing. And this leads to an overactivation of pathways. So this is, think about being super, super stimulated all of the time, and then you're having that overstimulation that's giving you that hallucinations and those delusions and all those different things. And so this excessive dopamine can lead to bizarre beliefs, continue, and may disappear only after experience demonstrates that what they're doing, that schema, no longer carry their explanatory power. So sometimes you can work through this, but it can be very problematic and contribute to schizophrenia. Psychological factors, we have the diathesis stress model, and that's the view of schizophrenia emphasizing that a combination of biogenetic disposition and stress causes the disorder, and that's saying that there's a physical vulnerability or predisposition to a particular disorder, but obviously other things are impacting it as well. With sociocultural factors, this influences how the order progresses. And developing in non-industrialist countries have actually way better results. I'm hoping to have time to go over an article with you in regards to schizophrenia in India in comparison to the United States. And it's pretty fascinating how culture can play such a significant role in determining how how a psychological disorder impacts an individual and a family, and how culture views that psychological disorder. So now we're going to talk about some personality disorders. And personality disorders are chronic maladaptive cognitive behavioral patterns. And the two that we're going to talk about are antisocial personality disorder and borderline personality disorder. And these are some of the scary ones. If you're into Criminal Minds, these are things that may come up. So antisocial personality disorder. So a diagnosis of this is guiltless law-breaking violence and deceit. That you do not feel guilty, so you're breaking the law, you're committing violence against others, you're deceiving others, you do not feel guilt over it. You have impulsive, irritable, reckless, and irresponsible behavior, which if you don't feel empathy and aren't feeling guilty about it, that's understandably a behavior you might engage in life. Exploitative behavior, where you're taking advantage of other people and you completely lack empathy. Psychopaths, which are a word that we love to use. These are remorseless predators who engage in violence to get what they want. So John Wayne Gacy, Ted Bundy, and there is a variety of psychopaths. There's successful psychopaths and there's unsuccessful psychopaths. And what they have found, for example, is that CEOs are more likely to be psychopaths than the general population. Etiology. So once again, what is causing this? So we have your biological factors. It is certainly genetic. The brain also plays a role in this. So less prefrontal activation. You can have structural abnormalities in the amygdala, which you think that's the fear center of the brain. Hippocampus with memory. You can have an underaroused ANS or autonomic nervous system. Testosterone hormone, which is associated with aggressive behavior. And this disorder is way more common in men. So that's antisocial personality disorder. And we're looking at those psychopaths, that guiltless lawbreaking, and all that deceit. The other personality disorder that we're going to be talking about is borderline personality disorder. And so some of the symptoms that may lead to a diagnosis are instability in interpersonal relationships and self-image. You can have impulsive, insecure, unstable, and extreme emotions. Very sensitive to the treatment of others. This may lead to paranoia. So this is where you have disturbed thoughts, you have delusions of grandeur, you think people are after you, you're being persecuted all the time. You may suffer from some types of dissociative symptoms as well. We have recurrent suicidal behavior and gestures and threats of self-mutilating. So something that is more common among people with borderline personality disorder than the general population is cutting. Though certainly not everyone who is a cutter suffers from borderline personality disorder. We also have splitting, which is thinking of things as being black or white. So you're not seeing that sort of gray intermediate area where things are either right or they're wrong, and there's no middle ground, there's no room for debate, there's no room for, well, maybe in this circumstance you can understand things. Etiology for this, it is absolutely genetic in nature. Child abuse or neglect absolutely contributes to this as well. Irrational belief that one is powerless, unacceptable, and that others are hostile, sort of like learned helplessness with the edge of paranoia. And so we have hypervigilance. That's the tendency to constantly be on the alert, like there's always going to be threatening information in the environment. 75% of people who suffer from borderline personality disorder are women. So of course we are going to end the chapter talking about psychological disorders and health and wellness, because how could we not talk about health and wellness? And so Rosenhan's study is one I definitely want you to read and be able to discuss in class. And it's about fake psychiatric patients where they've hired people to act like they have psychological disorders and what happens to them. And it certainly shows a lot about stereotypes and stigmas that exist, and shows how successfully functioning individuals with mental health issues or mental health illnesses may be reluctant to come out because of all of these different things in society that may be against them. So please make sure that you read it and are ready to discuss it in class.